Hello everyone, I'm Wave, and today I thought I would talk about a visual novel that I recently finished reading, being No Uta, otherwise known as The Song of Saya. It's a pretty short horror visual novel. It's pretty popular, I would say, because of its length, alongside the fact that it has a pretty popular writer behind it as well. So, let's get into it. So first off, I feel like it would be worth mentioning that because of how brief it is, there is a lot of people that have played it, and there is probably a lot of spoilers out there. So if you're somebody that has not read it like I was, I would say as long as you have not been spoiled on the literal ending of the visual novel, I don't think it's going to make too much of a difference. For me personally, I had maybe like one thing that was spoiled that I thought would be quite a big revelation. It ended up not really impacting my overall enjoyment. So I would say first off, if you have seen some talk about No Uta before, I would say don't worry, because in the grand scheme of things, it's not really going to impact anything. No Uta is a horror visual novel, and I want to say that one of the best things that it does is the overall presentation when it comes to formatting. There's two different types of presentation for text and how it's displayed in visual novels, being NVL format or ADV / adventure format. So adventure format is basically what a lot of visual novels have nowadays, where it's text within a dedicated box on the bottom of the screen. NVL format is more so kind of like how Fate Stay Night is, where there is long paragraphs of text that are displayed across the entirety of the screen. Because of the setting and how grotesque the imagery is throughout No Uta, using NVL format actually does help to further enhance the experience in a way, because even if you are somebody that is skim reading or just kind of going through and not listening fully to all of the voice acting, because you're seeing more text on screen and focusing towards the center of that screen, you're going to be less able to kind of zone out or be able to shy away from looking at the background images or just the characters on screen. So I think in that way it's quite good at being able to make you become more engaged with the overall setting of No Uta. Now, where I would say that is a rather good point towards the game. One negative that I kind of felt throughout my read time is, well, the fact that it is quite brief. For anyone that is familiar with the writer of No Uta, you would know that they're oftentimes kind of labeled as the quote-unquote killer. They have very much very shock heavy kind of stories, but at the same time they're actually quite good at being able to write very multi-layered characters, in that a lot of the stories that they do write have this sort of moral gray. And I feel like No Uta's biggest weakness is its overall length, because while I agree that a lot of people are able to jump in and it is quite good that it is very brief, a lot of people actually do go ahead and read it through in one sitting. For myself personally, I took that story across a couple different days until I finished it, and I think in the time that I was reading it across those couple of different days, I was kind of digesting it in a way to where the story feels a little bit too much of where you're being pulled along. And what I mean by that is that the characters that are throughout the story feel a little bit too much one note, apart from probably one character in particular. The main character that you, the player, are seeing the story through for a majority of the story is very reactionary, and I would say a lot of the characters kind of fall in with that same kind of way of progression, in that not a whole lot of actions are very meticulously planned or thought through. Things kind of just happen, and the story kind of is just this going with the flow, reacting to various things that happen until we come into the story's conclusion. And I feel like in that way it kind of does make the story as a whole feel a little weaker, despite the fact that you are seeing a majority of the story through a certain character's eyes, combined with the fact that with that NVL format that I was talking about earlier, where they're doing their best to kind of make you, the reader, feel very much like you are living within this world. in some ways it almost feels like you're kind of taken out of the experience because of just how you are just getting pulled around from story beat to story beat without too much like explanation. And I think maybe it is because I have read too many longer winded visual novels. It was quite a breath of fresh air to be able to read a pretty brief visual novel where I can kind of get in, experience the story, and then get out. But at the same time, I think that's one negative I would say about Saya no Uta, is that a lot of the characters do feel quite reactionary. They don't feel like they are actively going about and trying to push the narrative in their own way. Now, overall, too, I think when it comes to Saya no Uta being a horror visual novel, part of it for me feels like it's maybe a little bit too much of that like shock factor. I think it is kind of goes in line with the fact that I felt that the story was a little bit weaker, in that it's going to depend on like how you enjoy the horror genre. There is a little bit of that psychological horror, but I do think in a lot of sequences, or like a lot of the biggest moments throughout the story, it does rely a little bit too much on the shock factor. Now, what are my overall thoughts? I'm not really somebody that goes into too much of horror genre, even outside of visual novels. That being said, I want to say it's a solid enough story, considering how quickly you can get through the game, even like how many people probably do. You can get through it in one sitting if you really wanted to. I don't think there's really anything bad about picking up Saya no Uta if you haven't read it before. It is going to like kind of vary on whether you think you would actually want to enjoy it. For me personally, I don't really see myself wanting to go back to it at any point, at least currently, but at the same time, I'm still glad to have read it, and I think there was some merit in going ahead and reading it, regardless of the fact that I'm not too big of like a horror person in general. When it comes to like overall takeaways, like I said, probably don't want to go into it if you have been spoiled on the ending. I would say that is pretty much the main selling point of the game, is getting to the finale and being able to kind of take away the theme or overall message of the game. Whether that message of the game is going to really click with you or not is going to depend. I think it kind of does come a little bit too like out of nowhere, but at the same time, I do think it wraps up the story quite nicely. And then also, I would say if you are going to get into the game, you're probably better off getting it directly from the publisher's website, being Jast, rather than from Steam. You can go ahead and get the Steam version, and then you'd have to go ahead and buy the patch from their website anyway. Otherwise, I think you're going to have even less content if you don't get the like restoration patch, because perhaps the writer went a little bit like overboard. But Saya no Uta, I feel like, is pretty heavily reliant on its H scenes, and you're going to be missing out if you don't have that content. But yeah, those have been my thoughts on Saya no Uta. Thank you guys for watching. I've been Wave, and I will see you next time.